October 31st, 1512. The Sistine Chapel, Rome. Paint drips steadily onto the face of a 37-year-old man lying flat on his back, atop wooden scaffolding 40 feet above the marble floor. Michelangelo Buonarroti wipes his eyes with a paint-stained cloth. His neck cramped from months of craning upward, his beard matted with pigment. 4 years of back-breaking labor have led to this moment, as he applies the final brushstrokes to the hand of Adam, reaching toward the finger of God. Below him, Pope Julius II, patiently demanding to know when the ceiling will be finished. When it is finished, Michelangelo growls down at the pontiff, not knowing that this defiant masterpiece will immortalize both their names for centuries to come. The bloodline that produced this singular genius traces back through generations of Florentine nobility, though by Michelangelo's birth in 1475, the family's fortunes had significantly diminished. His great-great-grandfather, Simone di Buonarroti, had established the family name in Florence around 1300, serving as a member of the city's governing council during the tumultuous period when the Guelphs and Ghibellines battled for political control of the Italian peninsula. Simone's son, Buonarroti di Simona, born in 1320, continued the family's involvement in Florentine politics, witnessing the devastating effects of the Black Death that swept through Europe in 1348, killing nearly half of Florence's population and forever altering the social and economic landscape of Renaissance Italy. The next generation brought Michele di Buonarroti, born in 1355, who lived through the Ciompi Revolt of 1378, when Florence's wool workers rose against the ruling merchant class in one of the first working-class revolutions in European history. Michele's son, Francesco di Michele, born in 1385, saw Florence transition from a republic to the de facto rule of the Medici family, as Cosimo de' Medici began accumulating the wealth and political influence that would make his descendants the unofficial rulers of the city. Francesco's son, Alessandro di Francesco, born in 1415, lived during the height of the early Renaissance, witnessing the architectural marvels of Brunelleschi's dome on the Florence Cathedral, and the artistic innovations of Donatello and Masaccio that would inspire future generations of artists. Leonardo di Alessandro Buonarroti, Michelangelo's grandfather, was born in 1445, the same year that the Gutenberg Bible was printed, marking the beginning of the age of mass literacy. Leonardo witnessed the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, when rivals of the Medici family attempted to assassinate Lorenzo the Magnificent during Easter Mass at the Florence Cathedral. Though Lorenzo survived, his brother Giuliano was killed, and the failed coup attempt resulted in the public hanging of the conspirators, their bodies left dangling from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria as a warning to other would-be rebels. This violent political climate shaped the world into which Leonardo's son, Lodovico di Leonardo Buonarroti Simoni, was born in 1444. Lodovico Buonarroti, Michelangelo's father, came of age during a period of unprecedented cultural flowering in Florence. Born into a family that had once held significant political influence, Lodovico found himself relegated to minor governmental positions as the Buonarroti fortune gradually declined. In 1472, at the age of 28, he married Francesca di Nari del Miniato del Sira, a woman from a family of cloth merchants whose dowry helped stabilize the Buonarroti finances temporarily. Their first son, also named Lodovico, was born in 1473, followed 2 years later by Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, born on March 6, 1475, in the small hillside town of Capri, where his father was serving as the local magistrate. The infant who would become one of history's greatest artists entered a world in transition. In 1475, the Ottoman Empire was expanding westward, having conquered Constantinople just 22 years earlier, while Spanish explorers were pushing the boundaries of the known world. In England, the Wars of the Roses were tearing apart the monarchy, and in the German states, printing presses were spreading literacy and new ideas at an unprecedented rate. Italy remained a patchwork of competing city-states, with Florence, Venice, Milan, and the Papal States constantly maneuvering for advantage through warfare, marriage alliances, and economic manipulation. When Michelangelo was barely a month old, his mother, Francesca, became ill and unable to nurse him. Following common practice among Florentine families of means, Lodovico arranged for his son to be cared for by a wet nurse in the nearby village of Settignano, a community renowned for its stone carvers and sculptors. The woman chosen to nurse young Michelangelo was the wife of a stonecutter, and legend claims that Michelangelo later said he sucked in the love of stone carving with his foster mother's milk. Whether or not this romantic tale is true, the boy certainly spent his earliest years surrounded by the sounds of chisels on stone and the sight of skilled craftsmen transforming raw marble into objects of beauty and utility. Francesco Buonarroti died when Michelangelo was 6 years old in 1481, the same year that the Spanish Inquisition was established, and Lorenzo de' Medici narrowly escaped death during the Pazzi conspiracy. Lodovico soon remarried, taking as his second wife Lucrezia Ubaldini da Gagliano, but this union produced no children, leaving Michelangelo and his 4 brothers as the sole heirs to the diminished Buonarroti legacy. The family's financial situation remained precarious throughout Michelangelo's childhood, with Lodovico struggling to maintain the lifestyle befitting their noble heritage, while lacking the wealth to truly support it. In 1485, when Michelangelo was 10 years old, Lodovico moved the family back to Florence, enrolling his precocious son in the grammar school of Francesco da Urbino. Rather than focusing on his studies of Latin and mathematics, the boy found himself irresistibly drawn to drawing and sketching, much to his father's dismay. Lodovico had hoped that education would prepare Michelangelo for a career in commerce or government service that might restore the family's financial standing. Instead, the boy spent his time copying paintings in the churches of Florence and associating with artists rather than with the sons of respectable merchants and bankers. The turning point came in 1488, when 13-year-old Michelangelo convinced his father to apprentice him to the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of Florence's most successful painters. The standard apprenticeship contract bound the boy to 3 years of service, during which he would learn the techniques of fresco painting, panel painting, and drawing, while performing menial tasks around the workshop. However, Michelangelo's exceptional talent quickly became apparent, and within months, Ghirlandaio was paying the boy a small wage rather than charging the customary apprenticeship fee. During his time in Ghirlandaio's workshop, Michelangelo absorbed the technical skills that would serve him throughout his career, but he also developed a growing fascination with sculpture that would ultimately define his artistic identity. The workshop was completing a series of frescoes in the Church of Santa Maria Novella, depicting scenes from the life of St. John the Baptist, and Michelangelo contributed to these works while studying the classical sculptures that adorned Florence's palaces and public spaces. He was particularly drawn to the works of Donatello, whose revolutionary approach to depicting the human form in bronze and marble had transformed Renaissance sculpture from mere decoration into a vehicle for emotional and spiritual expression. In 1489, Lorenzo de' Medici established a sculpture garden near the monastery of San Marco, where promising young artists could study and copy ancient Roman statues under the guidance of Bertoldo di Giovanni, a former student of Donatello. When Ghirlandaio recommended Michelangelo for this exclusive academy, the 15-year-old found himself in the presence of the most powerful man in Florence. Lorenzo the Magnificent was not merely a patron of the arts, but a poet, philosopher, and political strategist who had transformed Florence into the cultural capital of Europe. His palace was filled with ancient manuscripts, classical sculptures, and contemporary paintings, and his dinner table regularly hosted conversations between scholars, artists, diplomats, and philosophers that shaped Renaissance thought. Lorenzo immediately recognized Michelangelo's extraordinary potential and invited the young artist to live in the Medici palace as a member of the household. This arrangement provided Michelangelo with access to Lorenzo's magnificent library, where he encountered the works of Plato, Aristotle, and other classical philosophers that would profoundly influence his understanding of art as a vehicle for expressing eternal truths about beauty, divinity, and human nature. He also had the opportunity to observe and learn from established artists like Andrea della Robbia, Antonio Polluelo, and Lorenzo di Credi, while participating in the intellectual discussions that made the Medici court the epicenter of humanist thought. Living in the Medici palace also exposed Michelangelo to the political realities of Renaissance Italy. Lorenzo maintained his power through a delicate balance of diplomacy, strategic marriages, financial manipulation, and occasional violence. The young artist witnessed firsthand how art served not merely as decoration, but as a tool of political propaganda, with commissioned works celebrating the Medici family's virtues and legitimacy while subtly intimidating their rivals. This understanding of art's political dimensions would later influence Michelangelo's own career, as he navigated the competing demands of successive popes, princes, and republics. The idyllic period at the Medici court came to an abrupt end on April 8, 1592, when Lorenzo de' Medici died at the age of 43. His son Piero, known as the Unfortunate, lacked his father's political acumen and charisma, quickly alienating both the Florentine nobility and the common people through his arrogance and poor judgment. Sensing the changing political winds, Michelangelo returned to his father's house in late 1492, but he continued to study anatomy by dissecting corpses at the monastery of Santo Spirito, despite the church's prohibitions against such practices. This clandestine anatomical study gave him an understanding of human musculature and bone structure that would distinguish his sculptures and paintings from those of his contemporaries. In 1494, as French armies invaded Italy and political chaos engulfed the peninsula, Michelangelo fled Florence for Venice and then Bologna, where he spent nearly a year completing sculptural work on the tomb of Saint Dominic in the Church of San Domenico. The experience of working in Bologna exposed him to different artistic traditions and techniques while reinforcing his preference for sculpture over painting. He returned to Florence in late 1495 to find the city transformed by the radical preaching of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who had convinced many Florentines that God was punishing Italy for its moral corruption and artistic decadence. Savonarola's influence reached its peak during the Bonfire of the Vanities on February 7, 1497, when Florentines burned thousands of books, paintings, cosmetics, musical instruments, and other objects deemed sinful or frivolous. The preacher specifically targeted Renaissance art that depicted pagan themes or sensual beauty, viewing such works as obstacles to spiritual salvation. Many artists fled the city or destroyed their own works rather than risk Savonarola's condemnation. But Michelangelo remained in Florence, quietly working on projects that would not attract the friar's attention. During this period of religious extremism, Michelangelo carved his first masterpiece, a life-size sculpture of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, commissioned by Cardinal Raffaele Ririo in 1496. The work demonstrated his ability to capture both the physical beauty and psychological complexity of his subjects, with a young god depicted in a state of intoxication that suggested both divine ecstasy and human vulnerability. However, the cardinal ultimately rejected the sculpture, perhaps because its pagan subject matter had become politically dangerous in the climate of religious reform sweeping through Italy. Michelangelo's career was rescued by the intervention of Jacopo Galli, a Roman banker and art collector who purchased the Bacchus and commissioned the artist to create a Pietà for the French Cardinal Jean de Billios. This commission would result in one of the most famous sculptures in Western art, completed when Michelangelo was only 24 years old. The Pietà, depicting the Virgin Mary cradling the dead body of Christ, combined technical virtuosity with profound emotional resonance, establishing Michelangelo's reputation as the greatest sculptor of his generation. The success of the Pietà led to increasingly prestigious commissions, culminating in 1501 with the Florentine Republic's decision to entrust Michelangelo with carving a colossal statue from a massive block of marble that had been abandoned by previous sculptors. The resulting David, completed in 1504, became an instant symbol of Florentine republicanism and artistic achievement. Standing over 14 feet tall, the statue depicted the biblical hero at the moment before his battle with Goliath, his expression combining determination with anxiety in a way that humanized the legendary figure while emphasizing his courage in facing overwhelming odds. The placement of David in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of Florentine government, was itself a political statement. The statue's nudity challenged traditional Christian artistic conventions, while its subject matter evoked classical antiquity and the republican values of ancient Rome. Citizens and visitors to Florence understood that David represented not merely a biblical hero, but the city itself, standing defiant against the larger powers that threatened its independence. Michelangelo's growing fame attracted the attention of Pope Julius II, who summoned the artist to Rome in 1505 to design and carve a tomb that would surpass all previous papal monuments in scale and magnificence. Julius, known as the warrior pope for his military campaigns to expand papal territory, envisioned a freestanding mausoleum decorated with over 40 life-size sculptures that would occupy an entire chapel in the new St. Peter's Basilica, which was then under construction. Michelangelo enthusiastically embraced this ambitious project, spending 8 months in the marble quarries of Carrara selecting the finest stones and overseeing their transport to Rome. However, Julius soon redirected his attention and resources to other projects, including the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica under the direction of Donato Bramante, who convinced the Pope that Michelangelo's tomb was too expensive and would overshadow the basilica itself. When Michelangelo returned from Carrara in 1506, he found himself denied access to the Pope and his commission effectively cancelled. Furious at this treatment, he fled Rome and returned to Florence, ignoring Julius's increasingly angry demands that he return to complete the tomb. The conflict between the artist and the Pope escalated into a diplomatic crisis when Julius threatened to excommunicate Michelangelo and invade Florence to capture him. Only the intervention of the Florentine government and the French king, both allies of the Papal States, convinced Julius to offer a compromise. In late 1506, Michelangelo met with the Pope in Bologna, where Julius was conducting a military campaign, and agreed to create a bronze statue of the pontiff as penance for his defiance. This statue, completed in 1508, depicted Julius in papal robes, but with a commanding gesture that emphasized his temporal power rather than his spiritual authority. The Bologna statue served as a prelude to the commission that would define Michelangelo's career and establish him as one of history's greatest artists. In 1508, Julius summoned Michelangelo back to Rome with a new project, painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The existing ceiling featured a simple pattern of stars on a blue background, but Julius wanted something more elaborate to complement the chapel's famous frescoes by Perugino, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and other masters. Initially, the Pope proposed a relatively modest scheme featuring the 12 apostles, but Michelangelo convinced him to approve a far more ambitious program depicting scenes from Genesis, the creation of the world, and the fall of humanity. The Sistine Chapel ceiling project presented unprecedented technical and artistic challenges. The chapel measured 130 feet long by 43 feet wide, with a barrel-vaulted ceiling that rose 68 feet above the floor. Michelangelo had to design a complex scaffolding system that would allow him to work on different sections of the ceiling while maintaining the overall coherence of his design. He also had to master the demanding technique of fresco painting, in which pigments are applied to wet plaster and must be completed before the plaster dries, allowing no corrections or revisions. Working virtually alone except for assistants who prepared pigments and transferred his drawings to the ceiling, Michelangelo spent 4 years painting over 300 individual figures across 5,800 square feet of ceiling surface. The central narrative scenes depicted 9 episodes from the Book of Genesis, beginning with God separating light from darkness and culminating in the drunkenness of Noah. Surrounding these central panels, Michelangelo painted 20 nude youths known as ignudi, whose athletic bodies and dynamic poses demonstrated his unparalleled understanding of human anatomy. The ceiling's edges featured Old Testament prophets and classical sibyls, while the corner pendentives showed dramatic scenes of divine intervention in human history. The iconographic program of the Sistine ceiling reflected the complex theological and philosophical discussions taking place in Renaissance Rome. Michelangelo drew upon not only biblical sources but also classical mythology, Neoplatonic philosophy, and contemporary humanist thought to create a unified vision of human destiny that encompassed both Christian revelation and pagan wisdom. The famous scene of God giving life to Adam through nearly touching fingers became an enduring symbol of divine creativity and human potential, while the surrounding narratives explored themes of temptation, fall, and redemption that resonated with viewers regardless of their religious background. The physical demands of the ceiling project took a severe toll on Michelangelo's health. Contemporary accounts describe him as gaunt and prematurely aged by the experience, his neck permanently damaged from months of painting while lying on his back and craning upward. In a sonnet written during the project, he complained that his back ached, his neck was stiff, and paint constantly dripped into his eyes. Yet he persevered with characteristic determination, driven by his vision of creating something that had never been attempted before in the history of art. When the Sistine ceiling was finally unveiled on October 31, 1512, it immediately established a new standard for artistic achievement that influenced every subsequent generation of painters. Giorgio Vasari, the Renaissance art historian and biographer, declared that Michelangelo had brought light to a world that for hundreds of years had been plunged into darkness. The ceiling's impact extended beyond the art world to influence literature, philosophy, and theology, as scholars and writers found in Michelangelo's imagery new ways of understanding the relationship between the human and divine. The completion of the Sistine ceiling marked the beginning of Michelangelo's mature period, during which he would create some of his most famous works, while navigating the complex political landscape of Renaissance Italy. Pope Julius II died in 1513, shortly after the ceiling's completion, and was succeeded by Giovanni de' Medici, who took the name Leo X. As a member of the family that had once patronized Michelangelo, Leo commissioned the artist to design a facade for the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, the Medici family's parish church where Cosimo de' Medici and other family patriarchs were buried. The San Lorenzo facade project, begun in 1516, represented Michelangelo's attempt to integrate architecture and sculpture into a unified artistic statement. His design called for a two-story marble facade decorated with statues, reliefs, and architectural elements that would celebrate both Christian themes and Medici glory. However, like many of Michelangelo's projects, the facade was never completed due to changing political circumstances and financial constraints. When Leo X died in 1521, his successor, Adrian VI, showed little interest in artistic patronage, and the facade project was abandoned. The election of Giulio de' Medici as Pope Clement VII in 1523 brought Michelangelo new opportunities and new challenges. Clement commissioned him to design and build a mausoleum for 4 members of the Medici family in the new sacristy of San Lorenzo, a project that would occupy him intermittently for the next decade. The Medici Chapel, as it became known, featured Michelangelo's sculptures of the idealized figures of Giuliano de' Medici, Duke of Nemours, and Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, each accompanied by allegorical figures representing day and night, dawn and dusk. These sculptures, completed between 1524 and 1534, marked a significant evolution in Michelangelo's artistic style. The figures displayed a new sense of psychological complexity and emotional restraint that reflected both the artist's maturing vision and the changing cultural climate of the 1520s. 5. The sack of Rome by imperial troops in 1527 had shattered the optimistic humanism of the High Renaissance. Replacing it with a more introspective and spiritual sensibility, that historians would later term mannerism. The political upheavals of the 1520s also affected Michelangelo personally when the Medici were temporarily expelled from Florence in 1527, and the city declared itself a republic once again. As a citizen of Florence and a man with Republican sympathies, Michelangelo supported the new government and even served as a military engineer, designing fortifications to defend the city against the inevitable papal and imperial counterattack. When the siege of Florence began in 1529, Michelangelo briefly fled the city, but returned to continue his work on the defenses. The fall of the Florentine Republic in 1530 and the restoration of Medici rule placed Michelangelo in a difficult position. Pope Clement VII, now firmly in control of Florence through his appointed representatives, could have punished the artist for his republican activities. Instead, recognizing Michelangelo's unique value, the Pope pardoned him and insisted that he complete the Medici Chapel sculptures. This pragmatic decision reflected the changing nature of papal patronage in the post-Renaissance period, as the Catholic Church increasingly valued artistic talent over political loyalty. In 1534, Michelangelo permanently moved to Rome, where he would spend the remaining 30 years of his life working on projects that reflected the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation. Pope Paul V, elected in 1534, commissioned him to paint a vast fresco of the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. This project, completed in 1541, demonstrated how profoundly the religious and political crises of the 1520s and 1530s had affected Michelangelo's worldview. Ispis pretres bu. Popoverti jus if bui. For, unlike the optimistic humanism of the ceiling frescoes, the Last Judgment presented a darker vision of human destiny, with Christ depicted as a stern judge condemning the vast majority of humanity to eternal damnation. The Last Judgment fresco sparked controversy from the moment of its unveiling. Conservative critics objected to the nudity of the figures and the inclusion of classical mythological elements in a Christian context. The Council of Trent, meeting to define Catholic doctrine in response to Protestant challenges, specifically condemned the use of nude figures in religious art. After Michelangelo's death, Pope Paul V ordered Daniele da Volterra to paint drapery over the most controversial figures, earning him the nickname Il Braghetto, the breeches painter. During his final decades, Michelangelo increasingly turned his attention to architecture, accepting appointment as chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica in 1546. This position allowed him to complete the work begun by Bramante and continued by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, creating a building that would serve as the center of Catholic Christianity for centuries to come. Michelangelo's design for the basilica's dome, completed after his death according to his plans, became one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world and influenced cathedral architecture throughout Europe and the Americas. The Dome of St. Peter's represented the culmination of Michelangelo's architectural career and his final statement about the relationship between earthly power and divine authority. Rising 448 feet above the floor of the basilica, the dome could be seen from miles away, proclaiming the glory of the Catholic Church to pilgrims and visitors from around the world. Its design combined classical Roman engineering with Renaissance aesthetics and Christian symbolism, creating a structure that embodied the cultural synthesis that had driven Michelangelo's entire career. Michelangelo's later years were marked by increasing spiritual introspection and a growing awareness of his own mortality. His poetry from this period reveals a man grappling with questions of sin, redemption, and artistic legacy that had preoccupied him throughout his life. His friendship with Vittoria Colonna, a noblewoman and poet who shared his interest in religious reform, provided spiritual comfort during his final decades. Their correspondence reveals Michelangelo's evolution from a Renaissance humanist, confident in human potential, to a more traditional Christian believer seeking divine grace. The artist's final sculptural projects including the Rondanini Pieta that he worked on until days before his death, reflected this spiritual transformation. Unlike his youthful Pieta in St. Peter's, with its technical perfection and idealized beauty, the Rondanini Pieta presented a more abstract and emotionally raw vision of suffering and redemption. The figures of Christ and Mary seem to merge into a single form, suggesting unity in grief that transcends individual identity. On February 18, 1564, Michelangelo died in his house near the Trajan Forum in Rome, 3 weeks before his 89th birthday. His death marked the end of an era in which individual artists could single-handedly transform entire cultural traditions through the force of their genius and determination. The Renaissance ideal of the universal man, capable of mastering multiple disciplines and creating works that appealed to both elite intellectuals and common people, would not be seen again in Western culture. Michelangelo's body was secretly transported to Florence for burial in the Church of Santa Croce, despite Pope Pius' desire to inter him in St. Peter's Basilica. This final act of defiance reflected the artist's lifelong identification with his native city, even as his career had made him a citizen of the world. The elaborate funeral ceremonies, organized by the Florentine Academy of Design, celebrated not just an individual artist, but the cultural achievement of the Italian Renaissance as a whole. The influence of Michelangelo's work extended far beyond his own lifetime, shaping the development of European art for the next 4 centuries. His integration of classical forms with Christian content provided a model for the Catholic Counter-Reformation's artistic program, while his technical innovations in sculpture, painting, and architecture influenced countless followers and imitators. The emotional intensity and psychological complexity of his figures established new standards for artistic expression that challenged subsequent generations to explore the full range of human experience through visual art. The Buonarroti bloodline that produced this extraordinary individual represents one of history's most remarkable examples of how genetic potential, cultural environment, and individual determination can combine to create transformative genius. From his great-great-grandfather's service in medieval Florence to his own achievements as the greatest artist of the Renaissance, Michelangelo's lineage embodies the dynamic forces that shaped European civilization during its most creative period. The family's gradual decline from political prominence to artistic immortality illustrates how cultural values evolved during the Renaissance, as society increasingly honored creative achievement over inherited status. Today, more than 4.5 centuries after his death, Michelangelo's works continue to inspire and challenge viewers around the world. The Sistine Chapel ceiling attracts millions of visitors annually, while his sculptures in Florence and Rome remain among the most photographed and studied artworks in human history. His architectural legacy lives on in countless buildings that adapted his innovations for new purposes and contexts, from the state capitol buildings of America to the cathedrals of Latin America. The story of Michelangelo Buonarroti represents more than the biography of a single artist. It encapsulates the transformation of European culture from medieval to modern, the emergence of individual creativity as a social value, and the enduring power of art to express humanity's highest aspirations. His bloodline produced not just a master craftsman, but a visionary who expanded the possibilities of human expression and left future generations a standard of excellence that continues to inspire and humble those who dare to create.